Hello everyone, my name is Jeff. Welcome back to HatCamBass's Beginner's Guide to Bass Fishing. This is part 8. In this episode, we're going to talk about the basics of making casts using our Baitcast reel. So before we get to the mechanics of making casts, we need to talk about how to properly set up our Baitcast reel so that we can make smooth, efficient casts and not have to worry so much about backlash. Backlashes can be reduced through practice and experience, but also by knowing a few things about the reel itself. Specifically, if we can make proper adjustments beforehand to our tension knob and braking system, we can begin to make consistent casts. Both the braking system and the tension knob affect the behavior of the spool during a cast, and when adjusted properly, they help reduce backlashing. Let's talk about the braking system first. Brakes help slow the rotation of the spool at the initial moment when you let the bait fly. This is helpful because the spool tends to accelerate faster than line can be dispensed, which is the cause of backlash. There are two types of braking systems on modern baitcast reels: centrifugal and magnetic. Both perform the same function and are always located on the opposite side from the handle. A magnetic braking system is adjusted using a dial like you see here. Simply adjust the dial to increase or decrease the braking power. A centrifugal braking system works like the brakes on a car and is actually located underneath the side plate. Most newer systems of this kind look like this and can be adjusted by engaging or disengaging these pins. Most reels have 6 pins, and engaging one or all of them will increase the braking power to varying degrees. To engage a pin, push the pin out from the center. To disengage, push it in towards the center. So what does this all mean, and when should you adjust the brakes? Applying a large amount of braking power to a reel means less chance of backlash, but shorter casting distance. Less braking power means longer casting distance and a higher chance of backlash. Brakes are often necessary in windy conditions or when using heavier baits. Experienced anglers will often use the least amount of braking possible, but as a beginner, it's best to start with heavy braking until you gain more experience. The next thing we need to adjust is the tension knob, which is located on the handle side of the reel. The tension or cast control knob applies friction to the spool, and it mostly comes into play at the end of a cast. Even when a lure has hit the water, the spool still wants to keep rotating. So what the tension knob does is help bring the spool to a smooth stop. Tighten the tension knob by turning it clockwise and loosen it by turning it counterclockwise. Adjustments to this part of a baitcaster are made depending on the weight of the lure being used, and there's a very easy and consistent method of doing this. Hold your rod tip out in front of you, disengage the reel by clicking the spool release button, and let the bait fall to the ground. What you're looking for is the bait to fall gently to the ground and for there to be no backlash on the reel. If it falls too quickly, tighten the knob. If it isn't falling at all, loosen it until it starts to fall gently. So now that your reel is properly adjusted for the lure you're going to be throwing, let's talk about the step-by-step process and some tips for casting. Let's start with the grip. Wrap your dominant hand around the rod handle and the reel so that your thumb is resting over both the spool release button and the spool itself. Casting with one hand is a great way to learn, so we won't worry about your offhand just yet. Next, we want to make sure that we have the right amount of line out. About 8 to 12 inches from the rod tip to the bait is a good starting point. Remember, we can dispense line by pushing the spool release button, which we call disengaging the reel. We take in line by cranking the reel handle, which we call engaging the reel. Begin the cast by pressing the spool release button and immediately placing your thumb onto the spool to stop it from spinning freely. Before beginning the actual casting motion, understand that there's many different types of casts that we use in different situations. We'll talk about the overhand and sidearm casts in this guide. An overhand cast can be executed with a very simple, compact motion that looks like this. Keep the reel in front of you and use mostly your elbow to move the rod slightly back behind your head. As you bring the rod forward, release your thumb from the spool between the 12 o'clock and 1 o'clock position to let the lure fly. Use your thumb to feather the spool while the lure is in flight to safeguard against a backlash. Keep your rod tip pointed in the direction you're throwing, and when you see the bait about to hit the surface of the water, press your thumb back onto the spool to stop it from rotating. For a sidearm cast, the steps are the same except the rod motion is different. Use more of a sweeping movement to execute this kind of a cast. It's a smooth upward motion with less elbow and wrist action. The release point should be just after you cross your body. Now let's talk about some common issues when casting and tips for improving. The most common issue when using a bait caster is casting too hard. Casting distance depends on many different things besides just pure force. So as a beginner, focus more on smooth casts and accuracy. Another common issue is the bait driving straight into the water. That's the result of releasing your thumb from the spool too late or using too much wrist. So focus on an earlier release point and using more elbow and arm movement. As you start to get more comfortable with your casting, add your offhand to the rod. Place it on the lower part of the rod handle below the reel. This hand adds additional control and power to a cast. Speaking of hands, you may have already noticed that if your dominant hand is on the rod during a cast, this means you'll have to switch hands to begin reeling in. While experienced anglers can often cast with both hands or switch hands mid-cast like this, casting and reeling with your dominant hand are the most natural way to operate a bait caster. And last, experiment with lessening the braking power and loosening the tension knob in small increments to get additional distance without backlashing. Alright guys, that's going to do it for part 8. Thank you so much for watching. If you've enjoyed the guide, if it's been helpful to you, do us a favor and share it with people that you know that might be interested in bass fishing. You can also support us by hitting the like button and subscribing to us on YouTube. We're ready to move on to part 9. Next time we'll be talking about how to properly work some of the baits we're using and also what to do once we get that first bite. Probably the most important question in bass fishing is, where do you find fish? It doesn't matter what bait you're using, what technique, or how expensive your equipment is, you're simply not going to catch fish if they aren't there. Cover would include naturally formed objects like lily pads or trees, and also man-made objects like docks or bridges. When you think structure, you should think change, specifically elevation changes. A specific arrangement of these changes makes what we call structural features, and here's what some common ones